Hi, everyone. I'm Andrew Weiss. I'm Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. And I'm just delighted to host today a very timely discussion about Russian domestic politics with two very prominent and well-informed Russian colleagues. We have Andrei Kolesnikov, who's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Moscow Center, and Ekaterina Shulman, who is a professor in Moscow at the Russian Presidential Academy of National Economy and Public Administration, and an associate fellow at Chatham House in London. Andrei is going to start the conversation. We're trying to get a sense of both public opinion and the political environment. It's been a very busy few months in Russian political life, but what we want to get at are some of the contradictions. And so everyone who's followed the developments in recent months, the arrest of Alexei Navalny, the street protests, and the intensifying crackdown on Russian civil society, might be surprised to see that there's some contrary patterns emerging in Russian public opinion. And Andrei is going to present some slides, which he's prepared using public opinion data, which we developed in partnership with Levada Center, an independent Russian polling organization, to give us a sense of the contradictions in the public mood. And then Katya has very kindly agreed to give us some reactions. And after that, we'll open this up to a conversation. I would hope that everyone who's tuning in on Google or YouTube rather, will offer their observations and hopefully their questions using the YouTube chat function, and we can make this as participatory as possible. So again, it's a real pleasure to welcome both Andrei and Katya here today. Andrei, why don't you show us your slides, and then we'll listen to Katya's reactions.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. We'll try to share the screen. Here it is. So here is the title. So I'd like to focus on something that is usually misunderstood, the mechanisms of behavior of the average mass person in Russia, who by his indifference and his aggression sometimes determines a great deal in the current situation in Russia. The collective Kremlin keeps a close eye on the demands of the masses and tries to respond to them, and at the same time to shape them. And here are some results of this policy. The opposition politician Alexei Navalny's near deadly poisoning, his return to Russia, and his subsequent imprisonment have only increased the Russian public's distrust and disapproval of him, paradoxically. The explanation couldn't be more banal. This is a case of shooting the messenger of bad news. With his investigations into senior officials and the film about so-called Putin's palace, Navalny has presented new proof of the corruption and moral bankruptcy of the country's leadership, but the passive majority doesn't want to know and would prefer to block out any unfavorable information about the country and the authorities. This was also the case of the Malaysia Airlines passenger jet shot down over Ukraine in the year 2014. Only 2% of respondents of Levada Center believed that Russia was behind the scene. And the 2018 story with poisoning of Skripals, only 3% blamed Russian intelligence in it. Now it's repeating with Navalny. For example, 55% of those polled were not inclined to believe that he had been poisoned. You can see some problems with Navalny's approval rating. Alexei paid an unbelievably high price to boost his trust rating by just 1%. It was an answer of the respondents to the open question, who is trustworthy among politicians, and the boost was only to 1%, from 4% to 5% of trust. This is the level of Gennady Zyuganov. So Recent protests have demonstrated the recovery of civil society, its capacity for solidarity, compassion, its high political culture, and this is indeed the trend. But it is necessary to distinguish between civil society, which is active and responsible and politicized, and society as such, the indifferent majority on which the regime relies. Since recently, the regime reduces the dialogue with the civil society to repressions and propaganda efforts, and the application of the authoritarian legislation, for example, new laws on foreign agents and limitations of educational activities. How does conformism work? The state buys loyalty by maintaining a minimum acceptable standard of living. The same strategy is applied to the middle classes, which is during fat years of the oil boom did not become a responsible citizen, but turned it into a consumer. When the boom was over, Crimea was offered to all the segments of the population as a compensation, and the consumer became partly a subject, but again did not become a citizen. We are talking about majority. And Putin's ratings dependent, approval ratings on two reasons. The retirement age reform and the pandemic. This is not all about politics or of the economy or social sphere. This is more about psycho-emotional sentiments of the population. On the other hand, since the year 2018, military and diplomatic victories have stopped mobilizing the population for rally around the flag. The Crimean consensus still exists, but it is a cold consensus, not hot one, and it is not capable to provoke mobilization around Putin or, let's say, collective Kremlin. Maybe the most important story was the growing dependence on the state. Conformism is based on paternalistic dependence on the state. In recent years, the state has been raising people as dependents. Even a drop in incomes doesn't provoke total discontent. On the contrary, the average citizen expects help or assistance from the government and votes for it. Incidentally, this will influence the relatively successful results of the authorities in the upcoming parliamentary elections. Dependence on the state is best illustrated by the structure of the real incomes of the population, the dramatic drop in income from business activities, and the unprecedented increase in social payments, while social policy remains extremely chaotic. The most frequently asked question is whether a generational shift can change a country. Putin is winning the battle for the average mass person, but is he winning the battle for the new generation, for the youth? 3 years ago, young people were one of the most conformist groups in the population, but now the difference between the 18 to 24 years olds group and 55 and over group has become noticeable. This manifests itself in everything, in particular in attitudes towards Putin. You can see this on this very slide, and in attitudes towards protests. This can be seen in the next slide. The same pattern can be seen, for example, with regard to foreign agents laws and in general with regard to any significant political issue. This is the optimistic side of the story. But in general, compared to the older generations, young Russians are really less paternalistic. The younger generation have grown up knowing nothing but Putin, but they have also grown up in largely modernized society with the market economy, open borders, and internet. However, any conclusions about a generational shift must be made with extreme caution, because at the end of the day, for example, the riot police who arrest opposition protesters with such brutality are also young people, as the technocrats in their blue suits and skinny ties focused on career progression, and the fat sellers are also young people, but they are conformists. And material wealth is ultimately more important for many young people than democracy. A generational shift can't work automatically, and it will take place if young Russians decide to break with the values of the antiquated state in the future, when this younger generation will go to the next group, 25 years old to 39 years old. But the very essence of the future political landscape is the battle for the young generation between the state and the civil society. I will stop myself here.
Thanks, Andrei. That's just a great presentation. We'll make sure that we put your slides up on our website so that everyone has access to them. I'm going to turn now to Yekaterina Shulman, who is one of Russia's most popular political observers and has really pioneered the use of social media to talk about complicated issues. And her YouTube channel has about 500,000 subscribers. So I really encourage everyone who's watching this now to subscribe to Katya's YouTube page. There's a crackdown that we're all witnessing on civil society, Katya. And I'm just curious if you were a former member of the Presidential Human Rights Council until 2019. How worried should we be about the pressure that's being put on people who are either involved in political activity or who work in media or work in the internet? And can you sort of put some of the Andrei's talked about the broad public mood, but clearly a lot of what we're hearing about right now and seeing on television looks very repressive. Is that an accurate picture of what's going on? Is this a broad-based set of repressive actions, or is the government doing what it does very selectively to kind of create a lot of fear and a lot of worry, but targeting a fairly narrow group of people?
Thank you, Andrei, for the opportunity to speak to this broad audience. It's somewhat embarrassing to be introduced as a video blogger. I still prefer to think of myself as some kind of political scientist, and people have talked about complicated things on YouTube before, and I hope we'll be talking after me. But still, I would like first to draw attention to some of the points that Andrei Kolesnikov has mentioned. Because Russia is not a democracy, but a personalist autocracy, some external observers tend to underestimate the importance of public opinion. So there's this picture of a Russian political regime as a one-man show, and of the president doing what he thinks is due to his view of his historical mission, no matter what people think or want. This is really not the case. The less you can allow yourself as a political model to conduct fair and free election, the more you will be dependent on the changing waves of public opinion. We know how anxious the powers are about the polling results, that they do not only closely follow the published results of polling work, but they also conduct some secret surveys of their own. There's even a department of FSO, the Federальная служба охраны, not the Federal Security Service, not the FSB, but the other service whose job is to actually guard the high administrative officials, but it also has a department which does polling. So quite a lot of things which are being said and done by the authorities are actually an answer to what they perceive as public demands. For example, the latest presidential address to the Federal Assembly, if you read it thesis by thesis, and if then you look at the, for example, top ratings of people's fears and concerns, whether on Levada's side or the more loyalistically inclined sociological service, you will see that almost every point was answered by the president. You will also see that the perceptible loss of enthusiasm for foreign policy adventures, for external world in general, has also been mirrored in the presidential address, which paid very little attention to either the military or the foreign policy issues. Returning to your question of the crackdown, of course we are witnessing a crackdown. We are in the middle of this vortex, but this is not something which started last week, and this is not something which started since the beginning of this year. We have had a turbulent 2019, which has largely been forgotten because of the many events of 2020, but which was the year of civic unrest and of the widespread police brutality. In 2020, we have had almost no public rallies because of the quarantine measures, and therefore it now, post factum, looks like a quiet year, which it really was not. But starting 2021, protests are back, and protests are taking place on a wider geography than ever before. I think for me, the most important feature of these Navalny's rallies in January and in April is a number of cities and towns, even smaller towns across central Russia, which because of its demographic and economic situation have been traditionally quiet, which have seen nothing like protest activity, public protest activity since the 90s. And now we see them participating in rallies whose price is constantly being raised by the authorities. We still witness the same type of repression, which depends not so much on scope or on extermination of those who disagree as on producing the impression. After April 21, during the protest of April 21 in Moscow and in almost every other city involved, except St. Petersburg and to some extent Ufa, the capital of Bashkiria, there were no violent actions by the riot police on the streets. Rather, the tactic was to come after the activists in the days after. And this produces a freezing, I would say, terrorizing effect when no one knows whether they will come for you today or tomorrow. No one feels safe. Again, the number of people detained is about 5 times lower than in January, but the effect is tremendous. The authorities try to avoid the bad picture. A police officer beating a young person on the street, or the impromptu concentration camp in Sakharova, which became world famous in January. And it became a kind of a center for media attention, and people who were arrested got acquainted with each other and formed a kind of brotherhood. So there was evidently a decision to avoid this kind of thing in the future and to present first a picture of peaceful protest. Again, in Moscow, I was an observer for the Moscow-Helsinki group during April 21st. It was as peaceful as possible, like in a European city. Police were guarding the traffic, and they were not doing anything to harass the protesters. But then, when people went home, then police and anti-extremist departments went after them. After the activists who were visible on social media, after the journalists, the majority of people are being let go, even the majority of those who are visited. But still, the very fact of this visit makes you feel very unsafe. And of course, all this happens on the background of oppositional leader Alexei Navalny in prison. And again, let me remind you that a week ago, we were afraid of his life because he was on a hunger strike. Now he's on a hunger strike no longer. Civic medical specialists were with him, so he got what he demanded. And his supporters the members of his team are also abstaining from either engaging in very evident anti-governmental activities or predicting more mass protests to come. So there's some kind of de-escalation on both sides. I know how this sounds. I know how contrary this is to the general impression. But when dealing with modern type informational autocracy, we have to be very careful about our impressions, because this is its business, the very core thing that this political model does, producing impressions, influencing people's minds rather than their bodies, unlike the autocracies or the totalitarian models of the 20th century. So, okay, I think the other things that I wanted to say will come up during answers to the questions.
Great. No, thank you, Katya. So, Andrei, let's turn to Navalny for a minute. And the reasons why, as you said at the beginning, his popularity is not growing, and that there's still only, depending on the survey, about 20% approval for Navalny. What does that tell us about the regime's vulnerabilities? In the Western discussion, Navalny is usually portrayed as someone who's telling the truth about how bad the government is, how corrupt everything is. And, the number of people watching his videos on YouTube suggests that there is a grassroots political movement that he can possibly lead. But the data don't confirm that. And so there's a disjuncture or a contradiction in what you see in the survey data. Is it because people are afraid to say what they like and don't like about political leaders, or is it because he just is not the catalyzing force and unifying force for opposition and unhappiness? Maybe unhappiness is a better word. Opposition is kind of a politically loaded word in Russia.
Yes, it's one of the most important questions. And I would say that Navalny became more recognizable for sure after his poisoning and returning to Russia. But at the same time, for an average man, for a mass person, he's an ununderstandable person, absolutely. Who's behind him? Does he do all the things himself, or with a little help of Western friends? A lot of people think that people who are going to the streets to support Navalny are paid by the West. What is the technology of paying? It doesn't matter. We don't know how, but this is really so, and this figure is growing up all the time. More trustworthy are, for instance, protests without Navalny. The protests of the civil society as such, not labeled by this name. For example, Khabarovsk protests are more trustworthy for the majority of Russians than protests for the support of Navalny. But at the same time, if we are talking about active part of the civil society, advanced part of urbanized, well-educated, primarily middle classes in big cities, they are supporting Navalny not as a politician after this story with his returning and arrest, but as a moral force, as a person who is intransigent, who is against the worstest features of this political regime. So there are popularity and popularity. Popularity among average Russians, who are very cautious about supporting somebody, and popularity among people who can be the members of a real civil society, active, educated, politicized, modernized, maybe the main word. So, and for them, Navalny is a symbol of modernization of Russia. And Putin is the symbol in that sense for these people as a symbol of archaization of Russia. And this is a big battle between modernization or normalization of Russia and archaization of it. Demute yourself.
when anyone hear me typing. So Katya, let me turn to the Putin part of the equation with you. There has been a remarkable long political career. He has beaten all sorts of enemies, whether it's been economic stagnation, street demonstrations in 2011, 2012, the international isolation after the war in Ukraine, now the pandemic. But is this, in the US, having 60% approval would be seen as really impressive. But for the system that is very personalistic that you were talking about, is Putin able to just survive indefinitely with the existing political order? Is this a system, a question has come in through the chat, that you described the system as unstable but sustainable.
Was I really so aphoristic and eloquent in back in 2015? It's a good phrase. I forgot about it. Нестабильно, но устойчиво. Well said.
Yeah. So is that still the case? And how how much can this reality sustain itself? Is it indefinite, or is there an expiration date?
None of us is able to survive indefinitely, so there's some sort of expiration date, both for any person and for any political model. Personalistic autocracies generally live as long as their leaders, but there are cases of them surviving a person who is seen as a founder. Some succession schemes play out well, more or less. We are witnessing a very interesting, especially interesting for us Russian analysts, experiment in Kazakhstan. So far, it's going smoothly. There's even some sort of very mild and very gradual democratization going on. So there's the first president, a political and moral leader, and there's a successor who is a real president, in fact, with almost all the president's prerogatives. So we'll see how this political model, this political machine survives this transit. Some of the personalist autocracies have tried to do the monarchy thing, to just install the son, the child, as a successor. The only successful case of this kind that we see in a post-Soviet space is Azerbaijan, which is a small, resource-rich, and a relatively mono-ethnic country. Russia is not like that. Russia is regionally diverse. The political system we live with has very much been dependent, not singly dependent, but much dependent on a president's personal popularity. So what is happening with the presidential support? You said that 60% would be a dream of any democratic leader, but the thing is that we are not discussing a democracy. So what we are watching is not the level, but the trend, not the static, but the dynamic. We can be entranced by looking at the figure 60, but what does it mean compared with yesterday, and how will it look tomorrow? So what was the trajectory of presidential approval, broadly put? It was at its lowest in 2011, 2012. The so-called Rakhirovka was extremely unpopular. The results of parliamentary elections in 2011 provoked mass protest. This state of public opinion continued despite the repressive crackdown, which was rather more violent back in 2012. We had more criminal cases than we do have now. And the events of May 6th remain the most violent street protests and the most violent fight with the police since then. So this trend, this negative trend of the loss of approval, the loss of support, was reversed by the annexation of Crimea. Then there bloomed this mesmerizing flower of the so-called Crimean consensus or Crimean Euphoria. It really united very variegated stratas of society. It brought down the differences between the demographic stratas. It lasted at its highest point for 2 years, 2014 to 2016. Starting 2017, it started to erode. You will remember the so-called youth protests of 2017, also instigated by Navalny and his video production. Since then, the young people started being the conformist generation, which Andrei has described, and became the oppositionally minded demographic strata. This is a very remarkable U-turn, which deserves more attention than it gets. Although maybe the most important thing to know about Russian youth is that there's so few of them. The generation born in the 90s is, moderately speaking, not numerous. But still, we had a decade of more or less high birth rates, 2004 to 2014. When these people start participating in social and, in some cases, in political life, we just have a more visible presence of young people in the public sphere. The generation born in the 50s was a very big strata. These demographic dynamics were actually behind the decision to raise the pension retirement age, which was so massively unpopular. So to return to the presidential support trajectory, 2017 to 2018, we had a rather stagnant or slowly declining figures. The change came in 2018. Andrei connected it singly with the pension age reform. But actually, if we look at the figures, we'll see that the decline started immediately after the presidential elections in March 2018. For some reason, and we can now only guess post factum what actually happened, there were evidently some hidden expectations of new policy course or maybe new faces appearing, irrational as it may sound, expectations connected with the presidential elections. When these did not materialize, nothing of this kind materialized, the ratings went down. The reappearance of the same set of faces in the government was extremely badly received. Although during previous years, no one cared much about the composition of the government, but suddenly people started to care. By the way, the change in the government made it much more popular, for example, in 2020, when in 2019. It shows us how great is the hunger for just new faces, not even for some revolutionary sort of change, but just for some change in personnel. This may be a prediction of what may be the public reaction towards, for example, the repetition on a new historical level of the events in 1999, when a not so popular president introduced his successor to the public, and that successor, instantly became popular. Again, this doesn't sound a very realistic scenario quite at the moment, but we know that nothing is impossible in politics. So, starting 2018, we had this very steady decline. Sometimes it goes swifter, sometimes it goes slower, but there has been no reversal trend. The generational difference, the generational gap, really stands between the strata of 55 plus and all the rest. The differences between 40 years old and 20 years old are not so perceptible as the difference between, I think that if the pollsters change this 55 plus to 60 plus, this will be even more manifest. So there's this baby boomer generation, which is different from all the rest without realizing it. Or maybe they do start realizing it. And this current crackdown, which is specifically a crackdown on younger people, public figures, new media outlets, is a demonstration of this realization that we, the Soviet baby boomers, the generation in power, will be succeeded by traitors. We will be succeeded by people who do not share our values, who will not carry on our policies. So while we are in power, we need to do everything we can to try to entrench these policies and these values as deeply into the very fabric of Russian power machine as possible. This may be the rationale behind the seemingly irrational and chaotic actions that we are witnessing.
Thanks, Katya. So, Andrei, let's talk about how the public mood affects leadership decisions and possible divergence and changes of direction inside the ruling class and elites. And I'm just curious, I take Katya's point that we see more protest activity and we see, society is changing, but the leadership and the elite have stayed very unified for most of the last 20 years. And you don't have groups of people saying very much publicly, and some people may say things privately like they're unhappy, but we don't see clear indications that they're willing to basically say, I've had enough. I can't handle this nice dacha and very good government salary. I have to leave. This is I've reached my my level of unhappiness that I have to publicly denounce what is bad about the current political system. I can only think of a couple of people who have done that in the last 20 years. I mean, it's a very small list. So the lack of split and lack of division tells us a lot, I think. I mean, this is my 2 kopecks, tells us a lot about the regime, that being in, the benefits of being in far outweigh the benefits of being out. And I'm just curious if that logic continues to you to seem persuasive, or if other events might shift that calculus for people inside the elite.
Yes, it's really a very important question, and I would say that we have not only budget-dependent, it means Putin-dependent population, but budget-dependent and Putin-dependent elite. They have to live in a shadow of Putin. Otherwise, they are nobody. They could be expelled from the elite, and they can change their fate in a very depressive way. I mean, they could be persecuted, for instance, etc., etc. The elite is nationalized. So Putin invented this term several years ago, the nationalization of elite, and it is continuing and may be completed. If you want to be inside the bureaucracy, you must be politically loyal. Even if you're a technocrat who is solving some small problems, you must be politically loyal as well. You are not making political decisions, you are not involved in a decision-making process, but at the same time, there are people who will make these decisions. You must simply improve the system from inside. Maybe this is your personal mission, and the case of justifying you're working for this authoritarian regime. This is a psychological point of being inside the elite. No signs and no institutions for possible conspiracy. No signs and no institutions for radical changes from inside the elite layer, and all the attempts of authoritarian modernization failed. There were several attempts of this kind, and the last one has been prepared by Alexei before this very term of Putin, but absolutely unsuccessfully. This regime doesn't want any kind of modernization because it is very dangerous for the very fundamentals of this political system. I would say that maybe there are some splits inside the elite, especially the civic wing of the elite. But again, if they want to keep themselves in security inside the system, they will have to play according to the rules.
Gotcha. Is conformism and material well-being the glue that keeps the elite together and supportive of the status quo? Is it fear and repression? What do you attribute the remarkable cohesion of the political class in in the face of all these very visible challenges that maybe might have promoted a split in another type of system?
On one hand, the elites, by their very nature, are supportive of the status quo. They are the status quo because they occupy the most advantageous position possible within the system of which they are both the beneficiaries and the support. So I think conspiracies among the elites happen mostly in novels. On the other hand, speaking of elite repression, if you look at the figures here, the number of regional governors, mayors of towns, members of the federal government, members of the Federation Council that have been arrested, or repressions inside the Siloviki community, and the length of prison terms that they get are incomparable to anything which is being done to civil society. When we get repressed, we get more attention, deservedly, I would say. We deserve more sympathy, but when another and the next FSB colonel gets his 16 years, no one is inclined to pity him that much. I do not think that fear keeps the elite silent. I rather suspect they benefit from their elite status. Elites can turn to the course of reforms when they think that preservation of the status quo by the old means, using the old instruments, is no longer possible. When they begin to be afraid of the future, when they begin to be afraid of losing their privileged position. And this is when reforms from the top happen. During the last years, maybe one of the very few real changes which happened is the change in internal policy management from the people whom I would call civic policy managers to the Siloviki people. So the electoral campaigns, policies towards the opposition, street protests, who is allowed to register as a candidate and who is not, what is an allowable oppositional activity and what is a prohibited one, has been to decide these questions has been the business of, again, simplifying things, the business of the political department of presidential administration. This is no longer the case. And this, of course, is not the change from the liberals to the hardliners. There are now liberals in the presidential administration. There has been a very widespread mistake here. But it's the change from people using various types of political instruments, sometimes violent ones. If we remember the glorious times of Surkov, political assassinations happened. Constructing a political organization and then selling it over to the police and to the FSB was a thing, of course. Crackdown on nationalists, on Limonov supporters was quite a daily thing. Again, it didn't affect the liberal part of the spectrum, therefore there was not so much attention nor sympathy. But I would never, any time of day, call these people liberals or find any advantage in their management over the current situation. There are some things to be said in favor of the Siloviki. They have more or less, well, they do their regulated thing. You know the procedure, you know the next steps, and you know how to behave yourself in this situation. Again, contrary to the chaotic impression which is being produced by all this repressive activity, we see, in fact, things that we understand, that we have seen yesterday and the day before, and that the civil society more or less knows how to deal with. Since 2020, very effective civil society organizations have grown. Organizations that provide legal help, informational support, передачи, food and water to the police stations, that conduct public campaigns, that coordinate the efforts of volunteers around the country, and that can communicate with authorities, sometimes with, again, minor technical, but still with success. This web of support is a very important feature in the modern day protest. I think, and well, maybe I hope, but I think that people who feel scared at the same time do not feel alone. The growth of the internet and of this civic part of the internet has ensured that no repressive step goes unnoticed.
Thanks. So let's maybe turn to the questions that have been coming in through the chat, and if anyone else who's watching wants to submit them. And I'm going to let's do this sort of in more blitz form, and I'll share a question and ask one of you to answer it. So let me start with Andre. And there's two questions about why the pressure on Navalny's organization. And if the picture that you showed at the beginning of someone who's not very popular and whose support is concentrated in the young people is a manageable issue for the regime. Why the crackdown? Why the attempt to kill him last summer using the most horrible means imaginable, a military nerve agent? Why the effort to destroy the political organization he's built? And why the desire now in the coming days to call his organization extremist, which would make it almost impossible for anyone connected to him to be seen in, polite, normal society. They would become pariahs. What is it, Andre, that is making the government so scared if the overall environment is generally favorable? The status quo, inertia, passivity, conformism. What is it about Navalny that triggers this kind of response?
This is not only the fear of Navalny, maybe the main emotion is disgust of him. He is another one from another generation, from another milieu. And I would say that the authorities, the very evolution of the attitudes toward Navalny, this is evolution of the regime. The evolution of this authoritarian regime becoming more authoritarian. And one of the symbols and features of this evolution is the attitudes toward Navalny. In the year 2013, he participated in the elections of Moscow's mayor, and authorities understood that it was a mistake to allow him to participate in a legal political process. So he was expelled from this legal political process. He became illegal. He lost his name because the authorities, Putin himself, didn't mention his name at all. And the regime can't relax for a minute struggling with Navalny, absolutely. He is very effective, Navalny, in terms of, let's say, public relations, intervening into civic space, being attractive for advanced classes, new generations, etc., etc. In the case of free elections, for instance, Navalny could be quite successful, not overnight, but maybe in a few years after the beginning of process of democratization of Russia, possible process. It's important the important side of the story is that all the persecution, cruel persecution of Navalny must have a didactic sense. This is a demonstration for the audience. Don't go in this direction. Don't follow Navalny. You will be persecuted. You will be punished. Be quiet, and everything will be okay with you. Adapt to the current circumstances. You can only go to the streets if you are, for instance, the member of any kind of organization which is struggling for ecological rights. But as well, it is not so. It could be also dangerous because ecological organizations could be persecuted according to the Foreign Agents Law. But Navalny must be persecuted. At the end of the day, he was poisoned. This is the indication of a current attitude towards him from the collective Kremlin, let's say.
So Katya, we haven't really talked very much about the way corruption affects public attitudes or elite attitudes. And the Western conversation, the idea, and I'm being very simplistic here, is that people like Navalny expose corruption. That creates worry and panic and anger response, and that corruption is kind of this magic kryptonite that, like just as Superman is scared of kryptonite, exposure of corruption is a weak point for the existing political system. And the videos and all the rest of Navalny's activity are, exposing vulnerabilities. Is that actually true in your mind, or is the elite and public understanding of corruption somewhat different?
First of all, there are no magic words that can topple a non-democratic regime. Any sort of revelation can be effective if it affects voters' behavior. It all boils down to this. If you expose somebody as a crook and thief, and then people stop voting for this person, again, in case of electoral democracy, so you destroy reputation, therefore you affect electoral results. If you are not an electoral democracy, you can influence public opinion, and so gradually influence people's political behavior. But this does not happen as a direct connection. I think corruption attracts attention of the people. We see it from the popularity of Navalny's videos. His last, the so-called Putin's Palace video film has achieved record-breaking number of views. This is a thing unheard of generally in the Cyrillic sector of YouTube. If it's not an unpacking video or a Masha and Medved, a new series, but a long and politically toxic, I would say, topic, the figures are mind-boggling. But it does not immediately energize people to turn out on the streets. Although this also has happened. For example, back in 2017, the youth protests organized by Navalny's organization were provoked by the video on the then Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev. So this also happens. This influences the general perception that the people have of those in power. For example, every next arrest of every next official exposed as corrupt does not produce an invigorating feeling of some national cleanup campaign which is going on, but rather reinforces the sense that everyone up there is a thief. And this is a thing towards which Navalny has contributed. I wouldn't underestimate its long-term effect on the public mind. When we speak about the general citizen being passive or conformist, the general citizen is always passive and conformist. When society becomes highly politicized, it's a sign, one of the precursors towards civil war, violent or otherwise. The ordinary person has to be passive. He or she is mainly busy with his or her own affairs. What matters is the behavior of the voters. What matters is the behavior of those stratas of society which are active enough to engage in direct political activity. What also matters is the opinion and behavior of influencers, of opinion makers, of people who are publicly visible. These three stratas are what actually matter. All the rest will follow in the lead when the moment comes. If people are not enthusiastic about Navalny, they will be equally unenthusiastic about, for example, defending the current state of affairs if something happens to it.
Thanks. So I'm conscious of our time. I see that we've got about 4 or 5 minutes left. So let's ask one more question to both of you that's come up in the chat. And I'm sort of curious to hear both of your responses, which is the role of the outside world on what happens inside Russia. And does it matter when the United States, the European Union, or others criticize the current political system, criticize the crackdown? Can external forces have an influence on the direction of Russia? Or are these sort of patterns of behavior and the system that's been set up largely invulnerable? Or is the external factor a major thing? Because as Andrei has written a lot, you know, the idea of a besieged fortress is a selling point historically for the Putin regime. It's a way of saying, see, there are all these bad guys and I'm protecting you from the bad guys who apply sanctions and, you know, want to take us back to the 1990s. Is that movie, which is being played again and again and again with the search for external enemies, is that an effective mobilizing tool right now for the big part of the electorate that is older and that kind of buys the official line? But I'm just sort of curious, just for both of you, to kind of give us your assessment of the role of external actors on what happens. Andrei, let's start with you.
Yes. Now our propagandists are talking only about foreign influence. Our politicians are talking only about foreign influence. And the Speaker of the Parliament, Volodin, said yesterday that according to his conspiracy theory, COVID was the invention of the American, I don't know who, of Americans, let's say. So, and this discourse is absolutely absurd, but it works to some extent. It works, but it doesn't mobilize people for rally around the flag. Any intervention from the West into Russian affairs, this is something bad, not only for the elite but for this average mass person, because this logic of a besieged fortress switches on overnight. They're attacking us this or that way. They are providing hybrid war. We must defend ourselves, and because of that, by the way, the most trustworthy institutions is the list of institutions are the army, FSB, Secret Service, and the Orthodox Church, and the president as well. President is at the second place as an institution. So it means that this strategy is still workable. And if some foreign organizations are assisting some NGOs in Russia, it has always opposite effect, because overnight they became the organization to be persecuted by the authorities, by police, etc., etc. So again, I will sum up my conclusion. It still works, but it doesn't mobilize.
Katya, a last word?
Hostility towards foreign countries has been in decline since 2018. The breaking point here was the World Football Championship. Since then, this tendency continued. Even during the large-scale state media campaign about either us immediately going to have a war with the United States or the invasion of Ukraine, no sign of pre-war mobilization was visible in the polls. Foreign policy issues continue to lose support. They are not on the radars of the respondents. The top concerns of the respondent are the rising prices, low salary, and economic situation in general, and every external affair is much lower down. I will disagree with Andrei about the presidential popularity. The most trusted political institutions list really starts with this conservative triad: the army, the Orthodox Church, and the FSB. The president is either the fourth or the fifth. And he has continued to see the decline of his trust levels during 2020, when every other public political institution, from the army to the governors or to business or to the Russian NGOs, has grown in support. 2020, being the year of the pandemic, has lessened the lessening atomization of Russian society. People have been obliged to work together and to help each other. So the declining trust towards institutions, which we have witnessed in 2018 and 2019, has stopped or rather reversed in 2020. With this one single exception, the president.
Terrific. Well, both of you have been incredibly generous with your time and your insights. It's a privilege to get to host both of you today. As I mentioned, we have a series of reports that Andrei has written that looks at the recent shifts in the public mood in the wake of the protests and Navalny's arrest. Those are available on the Carnegie website. We'll put his slides from the beginning of this presentation up on the website as well. I encourage everyone who's hopefully Russiyazhny to follow Katya's output in Russian, particularly to sign up for her YouTube channel as well. The two of you are just outstanding colleagues, and I can't thank you enough for what you've done today. Thank you very much, and thanks to everyone who's been tuning in. All the best to you, and I hope everyone stays safe and healthy. Have a great day.
Thank you very much. I must tell you at our parting that what I've done, I have copied the questions. that were being asked in chat so that they don't disappear when we exit this conference. I will look them through. The question part is always the most interesting part for the speaker, because I need to know what you, the experts, the listeners are really interested in. So I cannot promise to answer all your questions, but I will certainly read them and remember them.
Молодец. Thank you, Nadia.
Спасибо.
Thank you so much. Okay, thank you, Andre. All the best.